to Real People, Real Matters. I am Diana Tulchinsky. I'm introducing my first guest, Lynne, author, speaker, and expert on persuasion.
Thanks for having me, Diana. It's a pleasure to be here.
Please tell me about your earlier life in Minnesota.
Having grown up in Minnesota, I can say things like, yeah, sure, you betcha. And it took me a while to lose that accent.
Oh.
But one of the things I love about Minnesota is actually the wintertime there, because there are many more cold, clear days than there are here in Chicago. You get kind of the endless gray from November through March here. And in Minnesota, once it gets below 20 degrees, it's just cold. So you dress for that, and in Minnesota you have more bright blue days than you do in Chicago. But at the same time, you have less snow here, so there's a nice trade-off.
Oh, speaking of snow, how was your earlier life with your parents and like their careers? I know Minnesota is the lakes and the environment.
Right, the land of 10,000 lakes. My father was a salesman for a computer company. And back in the days when computers were relatively young and only big corporations had them. And he had an engineering background, which meant that he could talk to other engineers who were in those days, right, the folks who were buying computers. And my mother, on the other hand, ended up getting a job with the federal government.
Wow.
And rose to be part of, well, she was the head of property for Midwest, so she bought all kinds of supplies for the military in the Midwest. And I'm really proud of her because she didn't have a college education, and she worked really hard and took courses whenever she could to smarten herself up, and rose to be one of the higher placed civilians in the Department of Defense in the Midwestern area. My father, I'm proud of him because he went back to college after having returned from the military and went to night school and studied business. So both of them, I learned education was really important, and you don't stop learning just because you get a job. You find other things to keep your juices flowing and bring new things to who you are and to your job, and that's one of the things I love to do too.
What type of like personality is like in your father and mother's relationship and like in junior high era, like do you resemble or do you conflict with, like anything like that?
Well, I think I get my determination from my father. He was very focused. As I said, he put himself through night school while having a family and having a full-time job. And he knew what he wanted, and he went after it and was very determined about it. From my mother, I get more of the people skills. She supervised a number of people, and working with the federal government, you didn't really choose your employees. A lot of times you got who was already in the department. So she had to learn how to deal with people who were already there and perhaps had been there for a long time, and to get them to try new ideas and to stretch themselves where ordinarily they might not do that. So it's nice to have parents who have those types of very different skill set to contribute to my own.
And then for university, like I understand that your parents divorced and you had that conflict and you resolved that conflict. And then you went to university. Like, tell me about that.
Well, and I have to laugh because my mother, when she was young, wanted to go to college, and she was accepted into the College of St. Catherine, which is in St. Paul where we lived.
Yes.
And her friend who also applied was not accepted, and my mother was kind of frightened about living away from home because she grew up in a small town and ultimately decided not to go. We moved within a mile of St. Kate's, and when it was time for me to go to college, my mother really wanted me to go to St. Kate's.
That's nice.
And so I said to her, okay, I'll go, but this is the last big thing I'm doing for you. Then I get to pick my own things from here. And I literally walked or drove the mile to school the 4 years I was there while I studied. My master's, or my major, was in two of them, English and psychology double major and philosophy minor.
And I was just wondering, was your father in the background cheering you on, both your parents cheering you on?
Yeah, it was nice to have both of them.
So what happened like the first year? I understand that it helped you with your book. What was that major that you persuaded? Like, how was that internship and the first job that landed?
Well, and as you said, it was my first job out of college. I was a residential treatment counselor in a home for troubled boys. And the worst day I ever had on my job, on any job, happened there. And it was, I was the only adult in a boys group home, so I worked with 11 to 17-year-old boys who for one reason or another couldn't live at home. And there was one day when I was there by myself, and there were some boys who were, it was in the middle of the day, so boys were between classes. And I had a boy who had run away a couple of days ago named Fred, and Fred came back into Daniel Cottage, where I worked in Minneapolis. And because Fred was pretty sophisticated with the system, he knew he couldn't just walk back into the cottage. He needed to go to the intake department and tell them what he'd been up to for the past couple of days, so they could make sure that he wasn't a danger to himself or any of the other boys who were there. And so I remember saying to him at my ripe old age of 22, Fred, go to intake.
Oh,
and
so he ran away and then he wanted to come back into the facility.
Right. And Fred's response was, no, I'm going to my room. It's like, well, Fred, why are we having this conversation? Just go to intake. No, I'm going to my room. So we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Just go. No, I'm going to my room. So I went to the staff office where there was a phone because I wanted to call for backup to have somebody stay with the other boys while I worked with Fred to get him to intake. And he followed me into the office, zipped open his backpack, and pulls out what I still today believe to be the world's largest machete.
So there's no metal detectors back
Boy,
then?
not in those days, no. And he looks at me and he says, you try to call for help, I'm going to cut you.
Wow.
And it's like I'm still in the mindset of, but all you need to do is go to intake. I'm still in the mindset of, let's just tell you what to do and have you do it. And Fred's standing there with a machete, and there's no way he's going to do what I'm telling him to do.
They didn't check for drugs or like a drug at all during his...
It was a relatively open campus in those days, so he knew which doors to come in, and he was there. And there were actually some kids back behind him in the hallway, just kind of fizzing with energy because they were afraid that, Fred might knife me. And one kid even says, Fred, my man, gonna cut staff to the bone. I was like, oh, thank you for that. And it was at that point that Fred took the knife and chopped down and cut the phone cord.
Oh, okay.
So the phone I picked up to call for help, and I was alone. And at that point, I lost my mind.
When did it get physically violent? I like the ending. When did it get physically? Did you throw punches or?
No, I was lucky because so I just started babbling because I had no idea what else to do. And I said, well, Fred, I like you and you like me and you don't want to hurt me. And it wasn't until I really stumbled across saying, and you don't want to get into the world of hurt you're going to get into if you hurt me, that I saw something connect with Fred. It's like he blinked. And he later told me that he started picturing what his life would be like if he knifed me.
Wow.
That Daniel Cottage, where we were living, wasn't going to be his home. These boys wouldn't be his friends. I wouldn't be there to help him. The police would come and they would lock him up in some institution and take him to court, and that would be it for him.
How many hours were you battling with this troubled teen?
At this point, it felt like hours, but it was probably only like 20 some minutes.
Okay.
And ultimately what ended up happening is that I stuck my hand out and said, Fred, just make it easy on yourself and hand me the knife. And I wasn't sure how long we stood there. And all I remember is how sweat was running down my back.
Oh, I can understand. I can vision that.
And finally, Fred handed me the knife. And I remember locking it up in a cabin nearby and just, leaning against the cabin with my forehead, just taking a deep breath and then turning around and looking at the other boys in the hallway and saying, okay, show's over, go find something to do, or if you want, I'll find something for you to do. And they kind of melted away, and I turned to Fred and said, well, sit down and tell me what's going on. And I knew enough about Fred's history to know that his mother, he was with a single parent home, so his mother was schizophrenic.
Yeah, that term is not really applied to any community, but just like erratic behavior and then I guess withdrawal from like the maternal instincts.
And the tough thing was that for Fred was that she would tell him to do one thing, sit down and watch TV. So he would go and sit down and watch TV. And a little while later, she would come in and say, well, what are you doing sitting in here? Just go outside and play. And then he would go outside. It was nothing he could ever do would be right, which was his experience of adults, which is why he didn't want me telling him what to do, because he'd had plenty of adults telling him what to do his entire life, and he was sick to death of it. And it was at that point where I just sat and looked at him and thought, here is this skinny 14-year-old kid who's got a chaotic home life, and how can I be angry with him? And he told me the reason he got the knife was he had found it in a hall closet, and he had taken it, number one, to make sure his mother wouldn't use it on him, and two, to protect himself if he had. And like, the trauma that this kid had gone through. And it was probably about a half hour after that where other people from the children's home showed up on the cottage because they'd been ringing the phone.
Oh, sure, sure.
And and nobody had been picking up, and it was at that point that we let them know what was going on. And the good news, of course, is that because Fred and I had had the chance to talk, and he'd really had felt seen and heard, that there was no reason for any draconian measures to be taken. It's like he and I had resolved this between the two of us, and he could stay there. And ultimately, he went on to graduate from the program, and had a better start in life than if he had been institutionalized for this thing that had happened between the two of us. And I have to admit, so I did, as a result of my conversation with Fred, write this book called Getting Others to Do What You Want. It's on Amazon, and if you want to know how to be more persuasive, and fortunately you read it and said it worked for you.
Tell me the qualities when a person is combative or very confrontational. What signs do you use when not to persuade them to put the machete down, or for the state to intervene, or this? What type of personalities when a high schooler is majoring in the wrong field, or when to give up the effort or push them?
My belief is that most people are good, and most people turn difficult the way Fred did because they wander around feeling unseen and unheard. And the best gift we can give to anybody else in the world is actually what you're doing today, which is to sit and listen to them speak and understand what they're talking about and show that we're interested in them. And that bridges a lot of gaps. People who may be angry with you, a lot of times they feel that nobody's paying attention to them. And just by the simple act of doing that and showing them that you're listening to them and you're interested in what they have to say, a lot of times that brings the level of tension down to the point where you can get to what is the real problem, as opposed to because we've all had teenagers who start out with a complaint and then slowly but surely bring everything in, and it ends up being, and you're the worst person in the world. And of course it's like, oh, I'm the worst person in the world. But when you ask them, do you really believe that? Do you really believe I'm the worst person in the world? Then they can slough off all this other stuff, and you can get down to the point of what is the real problem, and then address that and lower the level of tension and ultimately help them make better choices.
What was your outcome, with that conflict? What was your, vision quest to saying that I can't take this job setting or this environment anymore? I don't want to be in this route after school, after those years of accomplishments.
Yeah, and it's true, because I took that job because I'd felt I'd focused on myself through high school and college, and it was time to give back to the community. And most people stayed on that job for about 6 months. And I had been there, ultimately, by the time I left, I had been there a year and a day, so at 22, I'd say I was a grizzled veteran. But I realized that that was not my gift. I so wanted to help these kids, but I didn't really have enough training to be effective with them. So I either needed to get more training or I needed to try something else. And as we were talking just before the show started, I was living at home at that point because social work paid peanuts, and it was hard to afford to move away from home. And I'd finally saved up enough money to get my own apartment, and I was looking for an apartment, and the help wanted ads in the classifieds were right before the apartments. And I saw a job saying writer, and I thought, well, English is one of my degrees, I should take a look at this. And it was a writer for a weekly banking magazine.
Oh, that's nice. And you also have a master's in the English.
And not at that point yet, but so I thought, okay, well, let's just apply. They're looking for samples. I can send samples. And so I sent them samples and interviewed with them, and they actually hired me. So it was quite a leap from doing social work to
the private industry of financials. It's
writing.
Really nice.
Yeah, writing financial stuff. And I had to laugh because I'd never had an accounting course, a finance course, or an economics course. So I win this job to work at a banking magazine. And the first day I'm there, they send me to downtown Minneapolis to interview 3 women investment bankers. And there's one woman who starts talking to me about Fannie Mae, and I know it's not the candy, but I have no clue.
No,
so I'm just kind of guessing until I get back to the office and start asking questions about things. And I think it was the day after that, they sent me to northern Minnesota to interview the first woman-owned bank president in Biwabic, Minnesota.
How is that community culture clash of Fred and the gun and then high-income bankers?
Well, and that's what makes your 20s so fascinating, because you get to try on a whole bunch of different things and see what works for you. And so there I was in a little town in northern Minnesota, and I'd never done this kind of work before, just the way I'd never worked with kids before. And so I decided what I would do is I would wander around town, and it was a small town. So I would talk to people in the town about the name of the bank president was Louise Nyssen. So I would ask people about Louise Nyssen. So I started collecting all kinds of stories. And my personal favorite was one about a person who had been sitting in her office, and Louise had a big picture window that looked out on the main street of Bilobic. And while they were talking, she looked out the window, and there was some guy skulking into a bar across the street, and she opened the window and she said, Norbert Pearson, you get in here and you start paying down money on your loan before you start blowing it over there in that bar. And so this is a woman who was running a bank.
Nice personality, the small town flavor.
Yep, so he came in and paid some money on his loan and then went over to the bar.
Wow, yeah.
And I had a hoot just talking with Louise about what it was like to own a bank during the Depression and all of the changes that she'd seen since then. And she used to characterize it by she had lived in time from the buggy whip to the atom bomb.
And so, like, was it family owned? Do you have diversity? Was that like a good variety skills and personality skills that you developed?
Well, and the idea of going up to people you don't really know and talking to them about pretty much anything is a great skill for anybody to have. And that's, so dealing with difficult kids and trying to figure out how to be more persuasive to get them to do what I wanted them to do, to show them it was in their best interest to do that, and then learning how to interview people to get information from them so I could go back to the office and write stories about them and about people and about banking industry stuff. As I said, I didn't have any background in it at all, so a lot of it I was just punting. And on the banking magazine, I had to write stories every week about things that I did not necessarily know. And I have to admit, back in those days before the internet, I spent a lot of time at the library looking up stuff because if I didn't know it, I needed to know where to go to find it.
Was it family owned? Was it very prestigious?
The publication was,
yes.
right, and they had a bunch of different publications, and ultimately, because it was family owned, if you weren't a member of the family, your job was kind of always in jeopardy. And the day came when my editor was my boss, and his boss, who owned the publication, decided that there was another member of the family who needed my job. And I remember going to my editor and saying, where should I go to look for a job? I haven't really done this a whole lot. And he said, well, try public relations, because Lord knows they need people who can write. And so I started interviewing with public relations agencies in Minneapolis, and my first real fine interview was with a company, and somebody was going to be leaving in 3 months. And I remember the head of the agency said to me, well, come back in 3 months, we'd like to hire you. And I said, well, I kind of need to eat between now and then. And he said, okay, we'll tell you what, we'll hire you and we'll train you so that you can just step into that person's shoes when she leaves. And I was really lucky.
And how many years were you in public relations? Was it like a knack, or of your writing skills or interviewing skills, or was it difficult to get into that?
Well, and that was the fun part, because in communications there are really two different ways you can approach it. You can work for a corporation, and then you have one story, and it's your job to write news releases about them, or write brochures, and now websites and all that sort of thing about that one company and that one story. And the blessing for me of working with an agency was I had a number of clients, 10 or 12, all at the same time, and all in different industries. So I got to learn a little bit about a lot of different things, which for me was a lot of fun. And I got to work with a bunch of executives, and usually men at that point, of companies that did everything from manufacturing circuit boards to healthcare devices, all sorts of things. And it taught me that I needed to learn things quickly, but I also needed to learn the important things so that I could share them with the people that they were trying to reach. And that's where I started doing financial, as you said, financial communications, because my boss at one point said, we're going to have you write a corporate annual report.
Oh, wow.
And he said, and it's going to be 12 pages plus cover. And back in those days, production took a lot longer than it takes now. And I remember sitting down to figure out, well, how many days do we need to have printed if we need to do this in 30 days? And how many days do we need to be going with the management company for reviewing the text, blah, blah, blah. And worked out I had 3 days to research the company, interview management, and write the first draft of this report.
And you didn't have any background educationally with financial statements and pension reviews and financial analysis, and no.
Nope, I just tossed me right in. And I remember doing what I needed to do and pulling the thing together, and it was done, and I took a deep breath, and my boss said, okay, well, now we got another one for you. And for years, a lot of what I did was financial communication. I sat down with CEOs to interview them about what's your growth strategy. And I have to tell you, particularly in those early years, I'd say, 80% of the time, they didn't really have a growth strategy. It was kind of like, let's just keep doing the same thing we're doing and hope for the best. And I had read enough annual reports and thought they were boring and filled with puffery, and decided that anytime I wrote one, I wanted to make sure it was worth reading. So there were a good number of CEOs who did not have a growth strategy, but by the time I wrote their letter, it sure sounded like they had one.
How many financial, like, Fortune 500 or what, companies do you interview, or do you remember like any big names or?
Locally worked with GATX, which is probably one of the bigger local companies I work with, a company called United Stationers, which now is called Ascendant. I'm currently working with US Foods. So a number of large companies, and they're interesting as well. They're as interesting as the small companies are, because there are lots of dynamics going on, and lots, as you can see, those three companies, totally different industries, each of them. And that's what makes it fascinating for me, because a good idea in one place is probably a good idea in another place. So something that's industry standard in one area can be a new idea in another industry that will be useful to the next management team I'm talking with.
When did you decide to move to Chicago? Did they transfer your position, or when did you decide to make the big move from Minnesota to Illinois?
And that happened because I'd been working with an agency in Minneapolis, and one of the people I'd worked with moved to Chicago to work with Towers, which is a Towers Parent, which is a large human resources consulting firm. And we'd kept in touch, and at one point she decided, she wanted to start her own agency, and she wanted to focus on employee communication. And that was an area that I hadn't paid much attention to, and she approached me and said, I'll move you to Chicago if you'll come and work with me. And I said, sounds like a plan. And came to Chicago, and we did something called communications audits, which are fascinating things, where you go into a company and you interview the senior management, you interview a number of people throughout the organization, you do focus groups and surveys, and you figure out how information flows or doesn't flow within the organization. And we would only take jobs where they would let us come back and present the results later and talk with the employees and the management team about what it was we were going to do to make things better there.
Was it effective? Like, when after you left, the morale of the company then?
And that was the tough part, because they would let us come back in and present the results, and they paid a pretty penny for this kind of research. But too many times we would come in and we would do the interviews, and morale would go up because people were listening, and it was us. And they would be interested in the results when we came back to present them. But then at the end of the day, companies would choose not to do anything to make things better. And then morale would go lower than it was before we started. And I thought, this just makes me feel horrible as a human being, to raise the kinds of level of anticipation and then not have any power to make things better when we're done. And it was from there I decided, okay, I need another job.
Was there like anything like unions, like anything of like steel industry, or like the management of those unions? Like, did they get anything out of those talks, or?
Well, there were some of the companies I worked with that were unionized, and some were not. And when we worked with companies that had unions, we were obviously interviewing union employees as well. I remember there was one company that we worked with that was an automotive parts company. And one of the truly fascinating findings we had about what was going on there was, we asked people, how do you get information if you're working on the shop floor? And what we discovered was, if you wanted to know something, you didn't talk to your supervisor, because we found out that supervisors, the people on the shop floor, thought that they knew a whole lot more than they did. And senior management was afraid to tell supervisors because they thought they would blab to everybody on the shop floor. So supervisor in a manufacturing facility, at least in those days, the worst job you could have, because you didn't know anything and everybody was suspicious of you. So if you couldn't go to your supervisor, where did you go for information? And we found out that people went to the maintenance folks. Well, why would they do that? Because the maintenance folks would see the things that got thrown out, and they would read some of the stuff that was in the trash.
Oh, that's
and then
nice.
share that information with the folks on the shop floor.
That's nice. It reminds you of kind of like Europe in like post-union, like, after like the Warsaw area, then like the unionized. And the
information
conflicts.
flows around, and it's good for you to know how that happens.
Mm-hmm. So, tell me how you met your husband.
Well, as a matter of fact, the job that I got after that job, I was working for the world's largest investor relations agency. So it was my job to tell CEOs and CFOs how to share their investment story with their current investors and to find new investors as well. And one of the things I did there was, now I was writing really big annual reports as opposed to the 12-page plus cover stuff I started with.
So you made progress. You made progress in investment banking and the conservative middle class and upper middle class.
You know, and you look at my resume and it made it look like I knew what I was doing. So I was on this job and I met a guy who was down the hall from me doing design, doing annual report design. And the two of us ended up at a wedding where somebody from his company had married somebody from my company. And the husband of a coworker of mine was sitting at another table and apparently spilled dessert down the front of himself. So he proceeded to pick up his tie and lick it.
Oh, so that's etiquette faux pas.
Yes, yes. And then, of course, when he finished licking his tie, began licking his lapels. And I sat there and made all kinds of comments about this. Yes.
Graphic wedding.
Boy, yeah. Not a guy I'd invite to my wedding. And so ultimately, I made all these comments, and Larry, who was sitting at the table with me, thought I was a hoot and asked me if I needed a ride home. And I said, no, I've actually got a ride home with your boss and his wife, because Larry worked at the design firm. And as I was getting a ride home, Larry's boss told me, well, you know Larry's getting a divorce, don't you? And I said, yep, didn't come up. And so come Monday, because that was a Saturday, I got a call from Larry saying, you want to go out for lunch? And I said, I heard you're going through a divorce, probably not a good idea. At which point he said, well, it's a bunch of us who are going. And then I just felt stupid. Okay, sure, all right, bunch of people, I'll go. And we went to the restaurant across the street, and he walked up to the hostess counter and said, 2 for lunch. And I said, well, what happened to the other people? And he said, they couldn't come.
Did you split the bill, or did you go out for Dutch?
So what ended up happening is the bill came, and I said, this is not a date. I pay my own way, thank you very much, which shocked him. And he continued to ask me out, and I continued to say no until he thought he got what was the clincher, which was tickets to a Bears game.
Oh, that's nice. Were you Vikings?
And I was a Vikings fan, so I already had plans to watch the Vikings lose to the Packers with some girlfriends of mine. And it was always my thing that you don't ditch your girlfriends if a guy asks you out when you already have plans. And so I said no. And I remember coming back into my office the following Monday, and there was a knit bear ski cap sitting on my office chair with a Post-it note attached to it saying, there's still time to switch, an anonymous Bears fan. And I thought, okay, I'll go out with the guy. And that was the beginning of our relationship.
Who in this family picture that got divorced was living in Glenview? Was he living in Glenview, or his family was living in Glenview? Or tell me
right,
the connection.
his ex-wife and his daughter were living in Glenview. So ultimately, when the two of us decided to get married, we thought Glenview's the place where we need to be because Larry's daughter Lauren is here, and we want to make things as easy as possible on her. And I remember we were looking at houses. It was the second house we looked at in Glenview. And we decided to make an offer on it. And we made the offer and worked with the local agency. And the woman came back and said, well, we need to sign some papers. And so we made a counteroffer and signed the papers. And that was a Monday. And Wednesday she said, come back in and sign some more papers. And we signed the papers, and she turned to us and said, well, congratulations, you bought a house.
So you're in Glenview. Tell me your Glenview library, minutes walking.
Right, and that's one of the things I love about Glenview is that there's actually a city center to it. And we live 2 blocks away from the library. And it was great because I could do all kinds of research there, and I'm an avid reader, so I could always go there and get whatever books I wanted. And there was the little city center downtown, and then of course they turned the Glen into another great spot. And it's not like so many other suburban cities where it's endless strip malls. There's a really home feeling to Glenview, and the homecoming parades go past our house, and we go for the 4th of July parades, and we go for the festival right before the 4th of July, and it's always great fun. And people have always been so friendly in Glenview. I really like this place.
Thank you, Lynne Franklin, for this very informative and persuasive conversation. It was very interesting.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And this is Diana Tulchinsky with Real People, Real Matters. Thank you again for watching us.